Welcome to the winning combination of Intacct, KnowLedger, and user-defined books. Hi, I'm Ann Costello, Managing Consultant at Cross Country Consulting.
And I'm Ryan Carey, CEO of KnowLedger. Today, we're going to go over a few clients and their workflows, and we're going to cover these objectives. First, I'm going to cover how to connect the investment data to Sage. And then Ann's going to cover the second one, working on the dimensions, and the third one, working on user-defined books. And I'll hand it back to Ann to start with the clients.
Thanks, Ryan. Today we have three different clients with three different needs. We have Chill Will, who's in charge of a company with multifamily office and trusts. Strategic Sydney, who is the controller for a single family office. And Complex Chris, who is the director of finance for a single family office with many limited liability partnerships.
And before we jump into the first client, let's get an overview and set a foundation of KnowLedger can connect to a lot of different tools and pull that into Sage Intacct. Here's a list. This isn't an all-encompassing list, but here's a list of the various tools that we can pull from. Now let's, in our three clients here, the first client is Chill Will, and we're going to use a data aggregator to pull his data because he has 10 different custodians that he's pulling from. So using the data aggregator makes it much easier. We have Strategic Sydney. She's using an investment reporting system we're going to pull from. And then Chris at the end, who is also using an investment reporting system, a different investment reporting system, and we'll show his workflow.
In addition to using three different data sources, these three clients all use Intacct user-defined books differently. Will uses his user-defined books exclusively to track unrealized gains and losses on his investment portfolio. Sydney uses the user-defined books differently. She uses it to track cost and fair market value, but using the dimensions in a slightly different manner for her reporting needs. And finally, Chris uses unrealized gains in his user-defined book, as well as tracking capital calls.
Now let's review the high-level workflow before we get into each individual client's workflow. So we have the custodian on the far left. It's the books and records. We have the investment reporting system there that's doing performance for the clients. Now, not everybody has that, but that's good to represent there. Then you have KnowLedger. Think of KnowLedger as the middleware, or what's typically done in workflows when we come in, and we have accountants doing that work right there, typing the journal entries into Sage. So KnowLedger takes that place. And then on the far right, Sage is the general ledger. Let's jump back to our first client.
This is Chill Will. It's a good thing Will's pretty chill because he used to manage 250 instances of QuickBooks for his clients that had 12,000 investments and over 1,000 bank accounts. Will operates in Wyoming, which has specific requirements for the reporting of trust principal versus income activity on the income statement. Will implemented Intacct as well as KnowLedger for the connectivity. So to start off with, now he only has one login instead of 250. KnowLedger connects from 10 different data sources, aggregates the data, and feeds it to Sage Intacct. Using the Intacct dimensions, he is able to track his investments, the cost versus basis, and also uses the user-defined books to track the fair market value.
In addition to going from 250 QuickBooks installs to one Sage, that's a huge advantage. By using the data aggregator for Will, rather than going out to 10 separate custodians, we're using the data aggregator to grab all that data. And you can see here the data we're grabbing. Then we pull it into KnowLedger. And what KnowLedger is doing is grabbing each one of those transactions and applying the logic that accountants normally would apply with their eyeballs, fingers, and knowledge to create the journal entries. And in the process, we're tagging it with all the dimensions and putting it into the proper user-defined books that Ann's going to dive into a little bit more here.
So what is a user-defined book? For most accounting systems, you have your main accrual book. But sometimes you have transactions that you want to layer on that you don't want in your accrual book. For example, tax transactions, allocations. And in the case of many of our family offices, they want to keep the unrealized gains and losses out of their accrual books. So this is a way of layering those transactions and then reporting your data. Another vocabulary, dimensions. Intact uses the word dimension to track a field, a category, or any other type of tag that you want to put on your data. One thing that's great about Intact is you can rename your dimensions. So for example, with Will, instead of using the standard dimension of department, he uses that to capture principal versus income activity. They use the item field to track the type of investment. Is it equity, debt, private equity, venture capital, or some other kind of alternative investment? They use the class field for the investment themselves. And when you have 12,000 values for your investments, it's sure a good way to keep track of it. Finally, the location are the actual trusts. They have 150 families with over 250 trusts and entities, and that's how they use Intact Dimensions to track them. So this is the solution that we came up with in order to track the income versus principal on the income statement. And then I'm going to show you how this flows to the balance sheet. So here are the revenue accounts. We have the realized gains and losses, and we labeled the accounts rather explicitly to show short-term versus long-term, and we had the P there for the principal. This helps the person doing the data entry get the right account the first time to help your data quality. And you can see that this is split between income and principal on the revenue. And then the expenses under Wyoming law are split half and half between income and principal. And you can see how that flows through. So how does that flow over to the balance sheet? So this is a breakout that shows the departments across the top only for the cost basis. And you can see that your investments, they're in the trust principal, and you have some activity in the liabilities that hit the income to come up with your total cost basis. Here we've layered on the user-defined book of the unrealized gain loss to come up with the total fair market value. And you can see that that unrealized gain and loss went into a specific account. You don't have to do it this way, but again, this helps with your data quality control to capture it in its own account so you know that you're not making an error. Here's a more compressed look where we have consolidated the trust income and principal for the total cost basis. We've got your unrealized gains and loss, and finally the fair market value. You can run your reports in a little bit more detail. You can, of course, run them by just an investment GL account, or you can group them and run them by different characteristics. For example, this is a way of showing who is the custodian for particular investments. We added that in the class. And finally, we use the asset class dimension to show the equities, to show the investments by equities, bonds, and alt investments, again, with the cost basis and unrealized gains or losses for the total fair market value.
That's really flexible, Ann. And that's the one thing I've realized working with cross country and that every single family office is unique and they can set it up uniquely in Sage Intacct every single time. So now we're going to move on to Strategic Sydney's workflow. Again, something unique. Sydney uses an investment reporting system. It's actually Mastro. But we decided to augment the Mastro data and pull also directly from her main custodian. That's given us some advantages from the data coming from the custodian, and it's given them the advantage to run their investment reporting system for different reasons than they would run Sage Intacct. So we pull all the alternative data from the investment reporting system, and then we pull the custodian data from the custodian, push it through KnowLedger, and post it over to Sage. So now I'll hand it back to Ann so she can explain how then she customized Sage Intacct for her needs.
Sydney has a little bit different setup. So they use their cash books to track the investments themselves, and they are using the department instead of class. Will used class, Sydney uses departments. They also use the user-defined book to track their fair market value, but they also added the class field to track whether or not something was an equity, debt, or an alt. So here's what this looks like for Sydney. You've got your long-term investments. They're using the class down the side. And then we can spread the fair market value, not just by the investment themselves, but by the asset class. One thing that makes this configuration great is it's super easy to make graphs out of it. And frequently family office members like to see graphs rather than just a spreadsheet.
Now we're going to move on to complex CRIS. Now this workflow right here is by far the most popular workflow across all of our clients. It's involving Addepar and Sage-Intacct. And at the bottom is where it adjusts. So you can see over on the left side, we have your typical types of investments going into Addepar, and on the right, you have what goes into Sage. What happens a lot of times when people don't have this integration, we'll try to force assets into Sage, or they'll try to force cash into Addepar, and it's not really meant for those items. So by using this best of breed, using both the solutions for what they're strong for, and then syncing the data back. And not all our clients push the balances back to Addepar, but it is very helpful. Now let's go over complex CRIS's capital call process. The capital call process is very unique per client. Not everyone uses this method, but I just want to go over complex CRIS's method. So what CRIS does is they write their capital calls out of Sage-Intacct. So representing the green part right here. So we create two different journal entries for this process, and using a suspense account to do a reconciliation. I'm using air quotes when I say reconciliation, but using the suspense account to do the reconciliation. We credit the bank account when you do the capital call, and then you debit the suspense account. When that data is put into Addepar, we then debit your private equity and credit your suspense, therefore using the suspense account to be a, air quote again, reconciliation of your Addepar data.
Here's how CRIS uses the intact dimensions. Like Sydney, CRIS uses the department field to track all the investments. They use the employee field for the owner because they want to have individual balance sheets for the owners. They use class for distribution versus contribution and the other capital calls. And then finally, they use the location field for each family trust and limited and LLP. Here's an example of how CRIS is using the dimensions to track capital calls. You can see that they are, this is a report that shows by dimension. These are just the distributions. They also track contributions for the same types, and then they're able to track it by the investment across the top. So this is an example of a report that's dimension by dimension for the investments.
Thank you, Anne. So this is a screenshot of KnowLedger and how the rules work. So at the top is the data coming from, in this example, Addepar. And then the bottom, it's showing the debit and credit that we define and then post over into Sage-Intacct. This is the screenshot of the dashboard from KnowLedger. And you can see here every month, you can run this daily, weekly, monthly, it's completely up to you. But in this demo, I ran it every month. There's October, November, December, you can see, and it processed all the data. So let's do a real quick demo so you can visualize how this process works. I'm going to run 1 month of data. This is KnowLedger, 1 month of data in KnowLedger. I'm going to jump over back to here to Addepar to show, here's the source data for this process. We have 121 transactions sitting right here. It just pulled the 121 transactions from Addepar. And what it's doing right now is it's applying the rules to this process. And it posted all 121 transactions to Sage-Intacct. This is Sage-Intacct, and if I query I call this the batch number, you can see right here it posted 121 journal entries. And it's very convenient because you can put it in draft or posted, and they're all in the same batch. If I look at a journal entry right here, and all along, Anne's been talking about the dimensions and user-defined books. You can see here in this demo environment, I used your regular chart of accounts. I used location. I didn't fill in a manager in this journal entry, asset class, and something our clients really like is the memo field, because we can map about any piece of data coming from the source system over into this field right here. Thank you for joining us today. My name again is Ryan Carey.
And I'm Ann Costello. We hope to hear from you about how you'd like to use KnowLedger, Intacct, and user-defined books.